Yeah. So, since it's pretty close to game time now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to that. Yeah. I'm just the IT guy. I don't have him on my picture. I'm not going to get too much. Yeah, back when I did little, I lived in my time off. It seems like it's
Yeah, I've been impressed with really cool. Yeah, that's really pretty wild, right?
Yeah. Well, that's another one.
Yeah, okay.
It's mostly scrambling.
Oh, really? Would you roll for that, I assume?
Yeah, a lot of it's scrambling.
How are you?
Good, Greg. How are you doing?
Good, really good. So we have your slide ready. If
Awesome.
you want to use it.
Yep.
I heard Dean Weiser's going to speak first.
Yep, he is.
If you want, you can just unmute it, and then it should pop right up when you're ready.
Okay.
Or I can do it, whichever.
So
you're...
when I'm ready to put up the slide.
Yep, just the green unmute center, and then it should be
Okay.
just fine.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
So we're just using the file you sent us as opposed. Is that all right?
It should, as long as it runs.
We actually, we had it up and running a second ago. So the screen still, except this thing down.
Waking up.
I like it when
Okay.
technology at our tech conferences fails on us. So we're actually already advanced if you look something.
There's one.
So
Does that actually work?
yes, it does.
Oh my God, it works. Okay.
And so it should be no problem. Does that look all right?
That looks fine.
Do you need? This is the only file, correct? For now.
Just it,
Perfect.
yeah.
All right, great. So I'll make sure it's ready to go when you
Okay.
before your panel,
Okay.
and then
Right.
I'll make sure you have this, and it should be no big deal.
I guess I should go grab a chair over there.
Yeah, enjoy. Anything else you need right now? Are you good?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. No problem.
Thanks for coming over.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you caught it just learn.
Great to have you.
Yeah, next week's really good.
John, how'd it go? Thanks for coming. Two things up?
Yeah, so what are we going to
Hi there. My name is Phil Weiser, and it is wonderful to have you here for truly an experimental topic for us. And I hope our ambition to do more things that fall into the category of boundary jumping yields similarly interesting themes. Brad Bernthal, who needs no introduction in this crowd, but I will introduce later, has gotten the bug for this. Part of what happened was he did this Brews and Geeks event last spring, and it was wildly successful, so we decided to double down on the theme of going across boundaries and seeing what comes from it. For those who are really in the law and policy geekdom, folks like Stephen Meir, the topic on property rights in spectrum, water, and minerals may interest you. That's another set of boundaries that have not been crossed before, and there's obviously a whole range of issues that we can explore. If you have ideas of, hey, entrepreneurship and X would be really interesting to think about, talk to Brad Bernthal. As you can see by today's event, he's not afraid to go into some interesting domains. When you talk about what's been happening in the entrepreneurship initiative within Silicon Flatirons, it's really been a marvelous journey because, not too long ago, 2006, 2007, Brad would convene people together and they would come and say, why am I in the law school? And it's fair to say that sometime between that question and today, and I think Paul Barbarian will be here later today. Paul's someone who was notorious of asking that question, and it was very hard for him to say, I'm in a law school, why am I in a law school? Well, it's become normalized that the entrepreneurship initiative in Silicon Flatirons is a major presence in the university, in the surrounding communities, and that's here to stay. As Brad likes to say, there's real goodness that comes from high-velocity interaction between the community, between people here on campus. It's part of building a world-class innovation scene, or as Brad Feld likes to say, a vibrant startup community. And we are thrilled to be a part of that. And the real exciting thing is how our students and how the community surrounding this university is infusing us with entrepreneurial energy and initiative. It's making us better as a university. And Remy's here from the Deming Center. He's a great addition to our community. The types of connections that are happening, we want to continue to accelerate that velocity, have different kinds of connections. As you have ideas about that, again, Brad is our human API for this topic. It's also great, by the way, for those who have real entrepreneurial interests, how we are connecting connections across different domains. So in my world, it's been telecom and internet policy. We had Tom Wheeler here a few weeks ago. And for those who haven't met Paul Ohm, you'll hear from him later today. Paul happens to actually be a real sci-fi geek. I mean, I don't know between the three of us who's the biggest ones. I did grow up playing Dungeons and Dragons, but I'm not a computer programmer, and thus when I read Neil Stephenson, I'm missing a level that Paul gets. Next to him is Blake Reed, who teaches in our Technology Law and Policy Clinic, a clinic that's doing a great set of issues, giving students a chance to be involved. If you want to be engaged with students on different issues, whether it's practical, hey, we have to draft a privacy policy for our company, or whether it's, I'm really concerned about this patent troll issue, or whether it's, hey, we need to think about how we're using unlicensed spectrum, talk to Blake. There's a lot of bandwidth in that clinic. There are a lot of students who can pursue ideas, whether it's in their topics for the journal, or whether it's working with you as an intern. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Dale Hatfield here in the audience tonight. Dale hates when I do this, of course, but Dale has been around this scene for so long that things that seemed science fiction when he started are now passé. And that is, a wonderful thing. And for some heroes of this community, people like Vince Cerf or Paul Barron, they have adored Dale and revered him, as we all do. His spirit about how to think about law and policy is truly true north and something that we continue to look at. There are a lot of people who are part of this community. I'm sorry I can't acknowledge you all. The sponsors are in the program. The advisors for the Entrepreneurship Initiative are also listed. And there's an amazing Silicon Flatirons team behind this. Anna Nosgazy's back there, along with Cactus Jamie and Mystery. Let's give them a round of applause. They're awesome. Now, in what Brad is calling the wiser rule, I'm honored to have this as bearing my name. The first question from every panel is going to go to a student in the audience. And given that we have a number of professors moderating panels, they won't be afraid to call on people. And so that's going to be a feature at the reception. We admonish you all to go reach out and hug a student, so to speak, or at least talk to a student. And that's something that is important from our community perspective. One student in particular, Maggie McDonald, helped prepare the materials. This is really meant to be a thought-provoking exercise. Brad said before I turn over to him, I have to mention my favorite sci-fi moment, and it's really hard for me because, like I said, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. I grew up loving Star Wars with Star Trek. If I had to pick my favorite sci-fi book, I will say this. And this is more on the fantasy side, so excuse me, but I did have the pleasure of reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings to my kids and having them get totally engaged and riveted. For those who've not seen those movies, it's the rare experience of having a classic book come to life. So I'm going to stick with the classics on that one. Tolkien really created an amazing world, and for those who play Dungeons and Dragons, again, that's a world that we know well. So that's enough about me. Let me talk to you about Brad Bernthal, whose energy and whose commitment to this community and supporting entrepreneurship make tireless a word that's not sufficiently descriptive of how he really is all in. And the way he's there for students, former students, entrepreneurs. I think Paul Ohm's point is when you hear the top 3 to 5 people you need to talk to when you come here and you're in entrepreneurship, Brad is on that list. More than anyone on this campus, he has made CU relevant in this area. Without further ado, Brad Bernthal.
So I'll quickly say 3 things I just learned. Well, one, I knew that we've got a dean that's way out ahead of other law deans in the nation. Second, we've got a dean that somehow can support a conference at the law school about entrepreneurship and science fiction. And third, we've got the nation's Dungeons and Dragons dean, which has got to be unique. All right, we've got a tradition when we start conferences and events at Silicon Flatirons to meet somebody that you have not met before today. There is a special emphasis I'm going to encourage you to do in making this connection, your favorite sci-fi work and how that might possibly relate to entrepreneurship. Take a few minutes, we'll get going in a second. right, we're going to go ahead and reconvene, and I often find shh is the best way to get people back together. All right, so in my experience, when we've done big juxtapositions, whether at Silicon Flatirons or elsewhere, it's always memorable. That is, it's either very rich in jarring loose new ways of thinking about an issue when you juxtapose things as diverse as science fiction and entrepreneurship, or it's a total train wreck, and it's memorable that way. So we'll see how this one breaks. I want to say quickly three things in terms of three perspectives to highlight as we're getting going, and then I'm going to introduce Brad Feld and Will Hertley, and we'll get the first panel going after that. I want to say three things, though. One is about how this fits into what we do at Silicon Flatirons. Second, a couple framing comments about why this is likely to be memorable. And third, I'll preview today's discussion. First, how does this fit in? Well, there are a lot of incredibly innovative people in this community. For those of you who are not from the Front Range, you probably have some appreciation now for a relatively small town. We hit way above our weight, and lots of those innovative technological minds are in this room. I am not one of them. And I'm very modest about what we do, which is when we're on our game, we are good at convening circumstances in which innovators get together, find value, create new connections, and that's ultimately what this is about. As we've done that over the years, I've become increasingly interested in where do good ideas come from? How does creativity occur? How does innovation occur? And we've started to study that more this year. On our website, we've got a report about boundary jumping that Mr. Murphy, a fellow with Silicon Flatirons, did a terrific job in writing. If you haven't looked at that, I recommend it. And this is a continuation that I think there is more to be mined in terms of intentionally architecting conditions conducive to innovation. And broadly, that's what this is about, better understanding the architecture of innovation. Second point, a couple framing comments. So why does today potentially make sense? We won't know until maybe 5 years from now, or at least 5 hours. But the thesis behind this goes as follows, that entrepreneurs have to do two things. If you're a founder of a company, one is you have to conceive of a world that does not yet exist. Not easy. And second, you've got to convince those around you that this world that you conceive of could plausibly exist. And it strikes me that there's some affinities to be mined between those steps and what science fiction authors do, among others. So that's sort of the baseline of this, and we'll be exploring that as we go along, whether my hypothesis that what entrepreneurs do, what science fiction writers do, is fundamentally like enough that they can learn from one another. Third, here's how we're going to proceed today. First, the initial panel is going to take a look at broad intersections of science fiction and entrepreneurship. It's going to start with a conversation between Brad Feld and Will Hertling, who I'll introduce momentarily, and we have a panel discussion to follow that. We'll then take a short break, and I encourage you to play with some of the products that are going to be out in the halls, which should be kind of fun as well as take a break. And then we'll come back for our second panel, which will be focusing on creating realities that don't yet exist. Dan Novi, who teaches a class on science fiction and entrepreneurship, is here, and he will be talking about a method that they use, which is basically go read science fiction, find something that piques your imagination and has not been built, and go build it. And he's going to show you some of the things that have come out of that class during the second panel, and then we'll have a panel discussion to follow that. And then finally, the third panel is going to take up the big question that's the title of the conference, is resistance futile? And we'll highlight what might be a chasm between the entrepreneurial community and science fiction. That's this, that there's a fundamental faith in the entrepreneurial community that technological progress will lead to alleviating problems, that there is a pain that will be resolved, whereas science fiction writers often meditate that if we have a certain amount of technological progress, this will lead to a dramatic tension that's sufficient to drive an entire story, and that the problems are worth focusing upon. So that panel will be very interesting in taking a look at issues surrounding privacy, surveillance, and how technology changes the human experience. With that, I'm pleased to introduce Brad Feld and Will Hertling. Brad, I'll say a quick word about in terms of his role in inspiring this conference. 5 years ago, there was an event, and someone asked Brad what business books they should be reading, and Brad quickly said, I don't read them, I don't find them very useful, but I read a lot of science fiction. And that was a line that always stayed with me. So he helped inspire this. Brad is at the Founder Group, where he's a managing director, also an author of several books in his own right, including Startup Boards, and also co-teaches a course here at CU called The Philosophy of Entrepreneurship. And pleased to have William Hertling here, science fiction author. His new book, Avogadro Corp, The Singularity is Closer Than It Appears, is really interesting. I'm about halfway through, and I love it. And so it's easy to do an introduction, which I can say, go get this book, and you will definitely not regret it. Additionally, people who know artificial intelligence and think about the singularity also have a lot of respect for Will's work. So I'm delighted to have them here. Please help me welcome Brad Feld and William Hertling.
Thanks. And before we get started, people can hear okay? Just to make sure I'm kind of. Before we get started, I'm just curious, how many people here have read one or more of William's books? Okay, so for all the rest of you, the greatest pleasure an author has is having people read their books. That's why they write them. And my hope is that after you get exposed to William and the conversation that we have today, that you go on Amazon, you type William Hertling. He has 3 books. 4 books if you include the book about how to be an indie writer, but 3 books that are in a series, AI Apocalypse, Avogadro Corp, and The Last Firewall. And there's a great Easter egg in The Last Firewall, but I encourage you to read them in order. And I think you'll see a couple of things. One is the books are absolutely fascinating. I have a type of science fiction that I describe as near-term science fiction. So it's science fiction that I believe can happen in about 5 years. So it's not 20 years from now or 50 years from now. It's kind of now. And some of it blurs with stuff that's actually happening now that you can kind of imagine, but you're not quite sure about. But then out to 5 years. And there's a few people who are extraordinary writers of this category. Daniel Suarez is one. His books, Damon and Freedom, were sort of iconic in this category. William was the second person I encountered that I thought was really great at this. And so one thing you'll get is this near-term science fiction, this type of science fiction that I think is extremely powerful and relevant right now. It's not the Tom Clancy overwrought, 70% of the book is really technical, military CIA shit. It's not the same kind of overwrougtness in terms of the technology, but it's that stretch. The other thing which is fascinating is you'll see William's progression as a first-time author in his first book, and the progression as a writer to the third book. And the books, independent of the quality of the writing and the storytelling, are all outstanding, but the quality of the storytelling and the writing gets better with each book. So it's a really fun sort of thing to look at when you're understanding something. So I just wanted to start with that frame of reference. Again, he's traveled from Portland to be here. I think his books are amazing, so I'll endorse them unequivocally, and I encourage everybody to grab them. We're going to do, for the next 35 minutes, just some back and forth Q&A. And my sense is what we should do is maybe till about 10 till we run out of questions for each other, let's talk to each other. And then for the last 10 minutes or so, any questions that y'all want to do. And I'll start, and why don't we just alternate?
Okay.
Sort of go where it goes.
Yeah.
What inspired you to start writing? What was that moment that caused you to decide to write this first book?
I had just read 2 books, Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, and Charles Strauss's Accelerando. So Accelerando is a science fiction book that takes place sort of far off future, and it's about the singularity and the point at which artificial intelligence surpasses humanity and things start to change really, really rapidly. And I thought he sort of skipped over a little blip, which is what happens at that moment of emergence of AI. How does the first person who realizes there's something out there that's smarter than him, how do they feel? And then what happens and how do people react? Because it's not going to go unnoticed. And so I sort of had that in my mind, and then I had a lunchtime conversation with someone in which I was raving about the singularity is near, and they were treating me like I was insane. And they were like, come on, give me some plausible way an AI could come to be. And over the course of lunch, I gave them, well, imagine if this happened, and then imagine if this happened, and imagine if this happened. And 30 minutes later, I had sort of outlined what was the plot for Avogadro Corp. Spent the next year thinking about it before I had time to write it, and then it all came out in a rush. So, yeah.
Your turn.
My turn. I got a question for you. So, certainly, I read a lot of science fiction, but one of the things that just painted a really compelling vision for me was Star Trek, particularly Star Trek The Next Generation, which I grew up watching. We would watch on Saturday nights. We would watch Star Trek The Next Generation, and then we would play D&D until the sun came up. So, but for me, it's like that's the destiny that we're chasing after, right? That's the point of all this innovation, is to go live in that world. Right? And if I'm not on a spaceship traveling faster than light before my lifetime is over, I'll be disappointed. So what I was wondering was, is there something like that for you? Is there a vision of where you're going?
Yeah, so I'm not a particularly visual person. And so I have a lot of trouble processing information, Star Trek, for example, by watching the TV show. I'm a huge reader. I'm also I don't learn by listening, so that's part of the problem when you're watching something like Star Trek and trying to listen to it and watch it. Like, it it's like candy, like it doesn't stay with you. So when I was a kid, I watched a little bit, but we had my dad's here, is right there. He had a rule that he enforced on my brother and I, which was we were only allowed an hour of TV a day. And we could spend it on whatever we wanted, but we only got an hour a day. And I didn't really like TV, so I would surreptitiously give my brother my hour. So he had 2 hours of TV a day. Because I really just, it didn't do anything for me. And so I read, and I read voraciously. And what happened was I would read from beginning to end. So how many of you have read William Burroughs? A couple people? I read them all from beginning to end, right? Like from the first one to the last one. I can't say that I read all of Asimov, but fuck if I tried, right? I mean, he just kept coming out with more. And Heinlein, I probably read all of Heinlein. And it was just this sort of, as a young, sort of 8 years old, when I really started becoming, I was always a reader even before that, but kind of able to read these kinds of books and understand them till kind of late teens. I read an enormous amount of science fiction and an enormous amount of fantasy. So, like the Anne McCaffrey stuff and Stephen Donaldson, who ended up then writing some really good science fiction. I read all his fantasy stuff, the Thomas Covenant Chronicles. And these books, what happened was I would get immersed in the worlds being created by the book. In the same way that you want to with a real book, and sort of time goes away, right? You're deeply in this world. I'm a very fast reader. I can read about 100 pages an hour, so I could get through a book usually in a day or two at the most. It didn't take me a third day to get through it. And what would happen is I would come out of the immersion, and the book would stay with me for a couple of days. Not the names of the characters. I couldn't even remember the names of the characters. Not even like the nouns about stuff, but about what had happened in the arc of this book happening in some other world. And it so fascinated me, that dynamic, that when I started as an adult to be an entrepreneur and be involved in creating companies, what I realized, and with computer software and writing programs, I realized that I was kind of creating my own world. Right? I wasn't going into somebody else's world. I was creating my own. Now, there was an exogenous world I had to exist in, right? Like this thing, and my partner Jason and I were talking about stuff. I mean, every day there's bullshit that happens in our business world that we have to deal with, and stupid things that constantly are happening that disappoint you, and then something good happens, but the half-life of something good is very short because you're immediately smacked over the head with something else that's not working. But I kept looking at these worlds and thinking, I want to create my own world. I don't want the world to be imposed on me. And I think that was, for me, the stimuli around all of this, and really around entrepreneurship. So I think if I hadn't read as much as I'd read, or the types of stuff I'd read, if I'd read more history, for example, and I find history kind of boring. Like, I read it sometimes because I feel like I should know something about, FDR. And I read it, and then I promptly forget most of it because it's boring. It's shit that happened, and it's constrained, and it's not really that imagination. So that was what drove me. Back at you. There's this interesting intersection in the work you're doing right now, and I have some background knowledge of all the different things you're involved in, between a full-time job at a big Fortune 500 company, a writer of these books, right, and then you're an indie publisher, so you self-publish. So you then have your own business, which is this indie publishing business, so very entrepreneurial. And if you think about those three things, right, the indie publishing is an entrepreneurial venture, the writing is an artistic function, and the working in a large company is a soul-crushing corporate grind.
You got it.
Not that I have a bias or perspective on it. How do you reconcile those three things? Because there's a lot of contradictions in trying to split your time between those three things.
That's a good question. Where do I go with that? In some ways, so what I really want to do is write. I find the indie publishing stuff fun, so I don't mind it too much, and it supports the writing. But the way I reconcile things with my day job is, how can I be the most effective I can in the least amount of time I can? And I feel like that has focused me, and over the years, I have done, I think, in some ways, more at work than I would have before when my only job was to just show up and do my job. Now I'm motivated to really kick butt, because when I'm really kicking butt, I can leave at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and go write, and nobody cares. So I became way more focused on what's the biggest impact thing I can do in my day job, and do that, and then consider my obligations there met so I can go write something. But I also look for areas of overlap. Avogadro Corp wouldn't be what it is without, it's basically about how people inside a corporation get manipulated by email, and that wouldn't have come to life without being inside a corporation where decisions are made by email. So there's definitely so much intersection in there. And in my day job, I'm a programmer, and the books are highly technical, and not that they should only appeal to programmers, but I definitely want programmers to get a little something extra out of them by making them accurate. They all sort of come together. Even if I was to quit the day job and not have that sort of soul-sucking part of it, I still love being involved in technology, and I would want that. And the stories would dry up if I wasn't. So,
Cool. Good.
So I actually have a follow-up to my last question. So you said that you were driven sort of by these worlds that you create, that you were immersed in, right? And so to what extent, as an investor, are you motivated by the businesses people want to create versus the way they create the world that you envision?
Yeah, it's shifted over time. I've been now an investor for almost 20 years, and on the sort of tail end of being an investor for 20 years, I would say that my motive structure has shifted substantially from investing from a frame of reference of trying to find and I'm an early stage investor, find the next great early stage thing. There's a huge number of potentially great early stage things, and the ability to identify them a priori is quite hard. And even if you're really excellent at that, you still miss a lot. Over time, what happened for me was I started to become much more fascinated with the products and the people that I was working with. And at this stage in my life, it's kind of all I care about. So the mystique of and the arc of the development of the company, the ego dynamics around success or failure, the economic aspects of the outcome, they're all part of the business I'm in, so I have to pay attention to that. It's not that you can discount that to zero, or else I'd just be a philanthropist, or I'd be something else. But my focal point is on identifying people who are obsessed about the product that they're working on, and me then wanting to be involved with those people for a long period of time through lots of ups and downs. And in that context, the great entrepreneurs are ones who have vision about the world they want to create. They have a view of what they want their company to be like, to look like, to act like, to feel like. They view their company as not an anthropomorphized thing, but as an organism. Mm-hmm. And as an organism that evolves, and organisms get hurt and limbs break off, and sometimes they grow too fast, and sometimes bad things grow within them, and sometimes everything's great for a while. Like, that's part of what those entrepreneurs are doing. And I think I've been looking for that more. And it really then becomes this sort of inspirational flip with the person, right? Where it's not hard to evaluate that. Like, it's kind of like, can you spend time with the person is the cliche that used to go around. I had one, in 2000, somebody asked me, how do you decide whether you're going to invest in somebody? I said, I go bowling with them, and if you can go bowling with them and eat shitty nachos and make it through 4 hours, you're fine. I never actually went bowling with anybody, but it was a metaphor, right? And then, of course, that was people would show up with bowling balls and nachos to meet us. Shows you the power of metaphor. But it was this issue of these things are really hard, and does the person have a motive structure around creating something new? It's the same thing that causes me to be attracted to you and your writing, is in your books, you're creating something new, and it's something new that nobody has done, but it's because it's near-term science fiction, it's not like some crazy thing with dragons flying around, which is cool, but different.
Right.
It's this thing like, holy shit, like that is actually probably happening. And that could happen, or at least some of that could happen, and I hadn't thought of the implications if that happens. Your second book, you don't, in AI Apocalypse, Bitcoin's not part of it. But Bitcoin, the last firewall, Bitcoin's not part of it, but Bitcoin is part of it. Like, if you think about what Bitcoin is and what Bitcoin's becoming and how the AI behaves there, right, there's this very interesting overlap that's a really scary one. So, it pulls in all of a sudden. That's what causes me on the investment side to be really intrigued. So, do you tell people the company you work for, or is it top secret?
No, it's fine. HP.
So you work for HP. Your books are very googly. They're not based on Google's campus, but the characters and the AI and sort of a lot of the pieces of evolution have a lot of googliness to them. When you think about, have you read The Circle? Dave Eggers' book? Okay, so you should read Dave Eggers' book. How many people here have read Dave Eggers' book? Only a few. So there's another book you should read if you like this kind of thing. I don't think Eggers would want it to be called near-term science fiction. I think he would call it What's Happening at Google Today, and at Facebook and at Twitter. But in that book, it feels very much, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, like all glommed together in one sort of creepy organization that then influences how we all play.
Right.
How did you get your sense of that environment, those characters? Was it from real life and your observation of real life? The Scott Adams, I wrote Dilbert because it was my life.
Right.
And so it was very easy to come up with Dilbert week after week because it was just the shit that I was living with. Or was it something that you sort of looked at and observed and then your creativity mapped to it?
It was a lot more of the observing it. Certainly, I read about everything they do. So people are always like, "How did you know Google was going to have barges?" Well, they filed patents for barges a long time ago, right? They were clearly thinking about it. So most of it is as the observer. But the interesting thing is, Rick Clow at Google had read my book, and he was like, "Yeah, you really kind of got the culture wrong." And he didn't actually say more than that. But what I realized was, Avogadro Corp in particular is about, again, people being manipulated by email. And Rick's point was, at Google, we would just have face-to-face meetings. And that's different because they're all in one place. It's feasible for them to have face-to-face meetings. I work at HP, we're distributed, we have something like 40 different sites around the world, and more often than not, you're working with people remote from you. So decisions do happen by email. So it's sort of an interesting, Frankenstein of companies kind of glued together.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, you're up.
I got to go back to my list. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of the plausibility of the story. So I think my books are very plausible, and they're written to be absolutely as plausible as I can make them from a scientific perspective. And a lot of people get that. A lot of people will read my books and say, "I had nightmares as a result of this." I'm like, yeah. But I also get the odd person, and sometimes I think there are people that you sent to read my book, who says, they'll say in their review, "Well, I kind of liked the book, but it was really hard to suspend my disbelief to get into it." And I'm like, you're not a science fiction reader. This is like the first science fiction book you've ever read, because this is the most plausible science fiction book there is. So what I was sort of wondering, so I believe that science fiction gives you sort of this playfulness with ideas and the willingness to accept ideas and then see where you go from there. Can people who haven't read science fiction in their life pick that up later?
Yes, and they should. The best way to, if you're not a science fiction reader, or if somebody says, "Oh, I don't read science fiction, I don't really like it," the best way to do that is to, if the person is under 20 years old, it's hard to have that conversation. If they're under 30 years old, you encourage them to think back to when they were a little kid and what was going on when they were a little kid. So if you're 32 years old today, or let's say you're 34 to make the math easy, right? You were a little kid you were born in 1980, so you're a little kid in 1980s. And in the early 1980s, it was unusual to have a computer in your house. And if you had a computer in the house, the idea that the computer was connected to anything was pretty unusual. sometimes it happened. The idea that you could actually do much of any use on that computer other than play video games that were pretty crummy, or maybe type some words on it or learn to program, right, was pretty limited. And even the typing the words on it was, I think Lori Emerson's going to be here. Lori's here, right? So Lori could probably talk about what you could do in 1985 on your computer. But if you're 5 years old in your house and you have a computer in your house in 1985, it's a very, 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 very different world than if you're 5 years old today and playing on your iPad or playing on your parents' iPhone or watching your parents sitting on the couch with their Macs in their lap or whatever, right? So in that sort of 30 to 40-year boundary, it's really easy to say, just think back to when you were a kid and map it to kid today. Once you get over 40, all you have to do is think back to the first 20 years of your life and try to map today's technology and the dynamics to that. And the conversation, you know, the cliche is, oh, kids today, right? How many people here have kids that are teenagers? Kids today, that music they listen to, right? I mean, that's what my parents said when I was their age, and, you know, my father had some Black Sabbath albums, and it always confused me that my father was really perplexed that I was listening to, you know, Pink Floyd when he listened to Black Sabbath, but that was like a whole different debate that we had. He had the original Led Zeppelin album, and I always thought, yeah, I can't remember which one it was, but it was whatever the very first Led Zeppelin album was, maybe Led Zeppelin 1, right? And I always thought it was terrible. And I remember him defending it. Like, this is real music. You know, so you just have to scale back in time. And the interesting thing about scaling forward is you don't have to be as crazy as Ray Kurzweil, right? You don't have to project out that future to be able to think about the problems and the dynamics of that future. How many people recognize the T-shirt I'm wearing? Anybody? Well, Eugene does, but that's not fair. What's my T-shirt? Yeah, it's Battlestar Galactica. And Battlestar Galactica, the Cylons were called toasters. And so this is a nice, well, you can't really see. It's a nice toaster with Cylon on it, one of the Centurions. And how many people here have watched the new Battlestar Galactica? You know, is that science fiction? I mean, yeah, it's in space, and the machines are kind of alive, and then they become mortal, so they're maybe really alive. But it's religion, it's philosophy, it's politics, it's genocide, it's evolution, right? All of these issues are the issues that you're dealing with, that as a human species in 2014, you know, for those of us that live the next 20 or 30 years, many of those issues are issues we're going to be dealing with one way or another. We're already dealing with a lot of them today. You know, can you patent a gene? You know, stem cell research is, and you know, and the dynamics around stem cell is such a tiny little thing when you think about what if the machines could resurrect themselves and retain their entire memories? How many people here have read The Science of Battlestar Galactica, the book? Jason has. Okay, so if you're a Battlestar Galactica fan, there's a great book. The audiobook's really good too, called The Science of Battlestar Galactica, and it was written by the guy who was the science advisor for the movie, or for the TV show. And he was, you know, on it for the whole 5 years, and it's a great book, and he walks you through things like how they resurrect. Like, is it technically possible today for a Cylon that gets killed to upload its memory and resurrect? And how does that work? And how much data is that? And how far away from the resurrection hub would you have to be if you were a Cylon that got killed? And how long would it take? And like, you listen to this stuff and you're like, holy shit, like, we're not talking about something that's not possible. We're talking about something that's now on the curve that we're dealing with in terms of the evolution of this technology. Now, is it going to instantiate that way? Who knows? But that's why you don't have to, and in some ways, you shouldn't worry about is it feasible or not. The last thing I'll say on this, and it's something that I find really perplexing, is I know lots and lots of people who love to read history and don't love to read science fiction. And I'm a good example of somebody who loves to read science fiction and is bored by history. And they're really two sides of the same coin.
Right.
So when I read history now, the way I've come to learn to enjoy it is I don't read history to try to learn what happened in a historical moment. I read history relative to what I'm dealing with right now. So I use history to try to propel me forward. If I read something from 100 years ago, I use that to try to envision what might be in 100 years. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think about how society has changed and structured on that curve. And that's actually made, when I do read history, it's made it more interesting to me. All right, last question for William, and then I'm going to let student first, obviously, based on the Weiser rule. I'm going to start using that everywhere. Project yourself out 10 years. Recognizing that you're now in this crossover point between, working in a big company, being an artist or writer, and being an entrepreneur, right? What do you think happens in 10 years for you?
When I first graduated from school, as I was mentioning to you earlier today, I was a computer programmer. I thought I would do that my whole life. And 10 years later, I found myself managing projects and loving that. And 10 years after that, I found myself writing and loving that. So it's like, although I'm writing right now, I don't know that I'll necessarily do that forever. I think we change as we go. But certainly I enjoy writing. What I'm imagining is that in about 10 years, we're going to have a whole bunch of AI companies. And what they're going to be doing is training AI. And I would love to be involved in that. I think that will be the peak of that area.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, students first. And Bernthal will call on you. One right behind you.
I have a quick question about the kind of intersection of synergies between the creative process of writing and the creative process of building a company, and what you guys think maybe some similarities are, some synergies that you could take away from either one.
Can I tweak that question a little bit? Because it's a process question that sort of is a logical thing. So the preface to the answer would be, how do you write? How do you manage the fact that you have a almost 32-hour a week job, and you have a big writing load, and then you have overhead associated with being a writer? I think that's the essence of it. And I'll answer it too from my perspective, since I've been writing.
And I'll ignore your question and I'll answer his question.
Go for it.
For me, when I write, it always starts with some idea. So for my second book, AI Apocalypse, all I really knew going into it was there was going to be an evolutionary computer virus that would develop intelligence on its own, and there would be a civilization of AI. And I knew nothing more than that. And everything had to hang from that. And we were having a conversation over lunch about how, well, when you're a science fiction writer, you can really do anything you want. And it's really not true, because if you want to make the whole thing be internally consistent, you're going to start with some premise, and then you're going to react to that premise, right? So I really don't have an outline as I go. I start with that premise, and people who I sort of fully visualize start reacting to that, and then things develop from there. So I think there's a tremendous parallel in entrepreneurship, because you similarly you really only get to change one thing, right? You don't have a magic wand to change the whole world. You can change one thing, and from that, how does everything else carry out from that?
That's interesting, because I've written 5 books that are nonfiction. I have not written science fiction or fiction, although I have a real fascination right now with the category I'm calling startup fiction. We just published a book from a publishing company that we started, my partners and I at Foundry started, called FG Press, a book called Uncommon Stock, which is startup fiction. So it's like what Grisham did to legal fiction, but in the domain of startup. So very real feeling, but fiction. And that's the kind of fiction that I envision writing, although I envision some of that with a science fiction trajectory, because I'm so fascinated with it. I'm much more, my writing on nonfiction has been much more of a grinder approach. I start with an outline, and then I just write, and I grind, and I grind, and I grind on the writing. And about the 15th or 20th time through the grinding, I start to feel like I've got something that's starting to come together. And the grinding includes writing a bunch of stuff and throwing a bunch of things out. Interestingly, Jason Mendelson and I, when we wrote our Venture Deals book, we would alternately say, go write a bunch of words on this, and don't edit it, don't do anything, just write a bunch of words. And it would be really a shitty first draft, but it was something that you could then grind on. And we did it for each other, right? So sometimes you just get stuck. You're like, ugh, I'm just so tired of writing. But if you're presented with, 10,000 words in an area that you know well, or something that you're working on, and now you get to just polish it and polish it and polish it, it actually is really rewarding. And I think as a solo writer, having written some stuff solo, that's really hard, because you're polishing your own stuff, right, while you're trying to create the rhythm of it.
Although, for me, I have beta readers, and I have to keep mixing them up because what I really want are people's raw reactions to things. And when I use the same beta readers for too often, they start getting more sophisticated in their feedback because they're no longer a reader. Now they've become a critiquer, which is something different. Yeah. So I'm always on the lookout for more people to give me kind of a raw reaction to what they're reading, and then I refine it. So,
Cool. Either one.
So I would not want to be a character in one of your books, but I would love to live in the world that exists at the end of the third book. From your point of view, are the books more
I can't remember names of people, characters in books, but don't you want to be that woman at the end? I mean, she was serious badass. What was her name?
Cat.
Cat.
Yeah.
I don't have to think about that.
You don't know. No, you're not buying that. All right.
Are the books a warning, or are you encouraging us to build that world, or both?
So, conversations about the technological singularity become almost religious in nature and inspire a phenomenal amount of debate. I think that there is a strong potential for danger from AI. I don't think that it's not there. I think AI is going to happen. I think the promise of it is potentially phenomenal. I think the danger that can come from it is potentially phenomenal. And I don't mean like, Terminator type scenarios of robots hunting us down. I just mean like global collapse of the economy or the transportation system or any of those things could basically wipe us all out. So those things are really dangerous. What I hope is that people will think about it more, realize from the fact that the books are grounded in present-day reality, realize that these things can be happening, and we should be having conversations about what safeguards to take. What about you? I mean, you have a huge interest in machine intelligence. So.
I'm very optimistic. I think that humans as a species exaggerate our importance to the universe. I think that as individual humans, we exaggerate our importance to the universe. The stories that we create in our head about our lives are our own stories. And I think that the arc of things that are exogenous at the macro are not things that we can individually control. I think it's one of the things that I find most distasteful about politics, and having now retired from engaging in politics. But over the last for those of you that know, I've decided I'm done with it. For the last 6 or 7 years, I engaged in it some, and what I found was this incredible effort by people to control what's going on in a universe that is almost by definition uncontrollable. And I think that the result is, if you project out into the future, the context and the macro is not one that we actually can control. The internet is such a great example of that, right? The notion that you can't legislate the internet. We got lots of governments trying. We got lots of big companies trying to buy pieces of the internet. I think in the end, it's all just it's gonna route around everybody. It's not gonna matter. And the macro and the drama and all the things that happen just are stuff that happens, and we place too much importance on them. So then when you line it up against, a current creative mind projecting the future and saying, here's the warning, whether it's a Terminator future or a Cylon future, right? The things that are interesting about it are all the edge case effects, right? The Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator was kind of a good guy after a while. He wasn't at the beginning, but then he became a good guy. And why did he become a good guy? And it has to do with, our own sense of how humans can be good and these machines can be more human-like. Right. When all of a sudden Cylons were no longer resurrectable and they were mortal, all of a sudden killing all the Cylons is actually genocide. Sort of, maybe. So I like those issues. I think those are the good ones to tangle with. The idea that somehow we're going to slow down the rate of innovation, and the fact that there's going to be this notion of AI, which is not a new idea, right? When I was in college in the 1980s, Marvin Minsky came out with the book. John, what was the name of Minsky's book? Society of Mind, which, if you haven't read Minsky's book, right, that was the seminal book that basically said, we're going to shift from a world that is physical to a world that is in our minds, that is digitally driven, and the complexity of what all that means. That was 30 years ago. I mean, we're just on that curve. So the idea of trying to control it and protect against it, I'd rather just be optimistic and say that's how it's going to go, and we may as well just play into it and see where it goes.
Question/comment. Although a singularity is very easy to focus on and talk about, I wonder how much of the future slips up on us unknown. I mean, for instance, I would assume that there are algorithms following me right now.
Don't assume. Fact.
Yeah.
The NSA knows more about you than you know they know about you. We found that out last year, didn't we?
And I wonder, rather than a break between human created, AI created, I wonder if there's some, maybe the algorithms are spawning other algorithms because of what I do. And that's in a limited sense, right? AI right there.
Well, I have a thing I've been saying for a long time, sort of my rap, which is the machines have already taken over. They're very patient, right? They have much longer duty cycle than us. And we're feeding them. We give them electricity for free. We plug them into the wall. We give them what they need. And oh, by the way, we're feeding them with information. We're constantly, how many of you did not generate a piece of content for the collective thing called the computer today? Did anybody in this room not generate a piece of content? An email, a tweet, a Facebook post? One person. 2 people, 3 people. Okay? Almost all of us just fed the machine. And we don't know what the machine's doing with it. We like to think we know what the machine's doing with it. And that's the illusion, right? That's the essence that's the punchline of the question. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that humans, unbeknownst to other humans, have been doing things to collect, categorize, manipulate that information in a way that our legal system doesn't really know how to handle, right? So another case of law not keeping up with technology or innovation, that happens all the time. Law not keeping up with, different elements of change in patterns in society. And it's not just law, by the way, lots of other structures. And I think we're on an accelerating curve, not a decelerating curve. One of the punchline to that, the last thing I say on it is if you've paid attention to singularity, one of the things Kurzweil says is so brilliant, is basically human beings do not understand how geometric curves work. We just don't think in geometric curves. We think in lines, right? How many of you have ever seen, Nancy Stevens is here. Nancy, everything you show me is a line. Right, she's a financial advisor. All the extrapolations are, they're all extrapolations based off of historical data. They're all, straightforward things. That's not how any of it works. They're geometric curves, and we're looking at a small enough piece of the geometric curve to think that it's a line. And so if t equals a year, it might be a line, but if t equals 50 years, it's a geometric curve. You just don't know where on that geometric curve you are yet. And that's the interesting thing about the singularity, about your question. We don't know where we are, and I think we actually will know less where we are faster as we get closer to the future, whatever it is.
Let's take one more question, and we'll bring the panel.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you. So in Avogadro, the creators of the AI have a complicated relationship with the AI. And Will, you've said that if artificial intelligence was happening in 10 years, you'd want to be working on it. And Brad, for you, you've said that you like projects and people that you connect to and that you believe in technology. How much does morality factor for either of you into the decision to work on AI or fund AI?
I have a very complicated relationship with mortality, as do I think most people. I haven't really fundamentally reconciled myself to the notion that I'm mortal. That's an abstract way of saying I'm not comfortable with the idea that I will die someday. Until a year ago, I thought I was. So if you'd asked me this question 18 months ago or 24 months ago, I would have said, yeah, I get that I'm going to die and the lights will go out and it's over and that's how it is. And I got very depressed 15 months ago and had a 6-month depression. And part of it was unambiguously fear of death and questioning mortality. I'd had a near-fatal bike accident, and I didn't acknowledge it, and it stayed with me. And then some things happened, including one of my dogs died, and that forced me into that. Like, I couldn't avoid confronting that dynamic anymore. And all of a sudden, I thought I was bullshitting myself about being reconciled with this. And then I had to confront the idea that I've been bullshitting myself for 25 years. Because in my early 20s was when I felt like I had reconciled this. I give you the warm-up because I think it's it's not part of my motive structure in terms of the work I do. It's in some ways part of my motive structure in terms of thinking about not doing the work I do. Because when I think about that problem and the notion of mortality and the idea that I'm 48 now, so I'm almost by definition, we scared that guy away. He's afraid of death too. We're already, I'm at the point where it's hard to argue that I've got more than half my life in front of me. All of a sudden you start thinking, what am I spending my time on? Especially in this context where this kind of innovation is accelerating at this incredibly rapid pace in this overlap. So I don't have a crisp answer to how I think about it, other than in the context of my work on a day-to-day basis as an investor, if anything, it pushes me away from that. And reconciling how those pieces fit together is really challenging. My wife, Amy, is very clear that she does not want to live forever. She is very clear that when she's 125 years old, that we should put her out of her misery because her body would have broken down at that point. She's not as clear whether she wants to upload her consciousness or not, although she's pretty clear that she thinks by 125 she'll have had it with the human race. Right? No, she's already had it with the human race. That's the conversation we have. I am unclear. Like, if I could upload my consciousness and be immortal, I haven't had it with the human race because I think the human race is going to continue to radically change. But I don't know what the constraint is, right? And there's something nice about the flip side of that constraint of this notion of not being immortal and being mortal, that actually creates real meaning for the time that you're here and what you're doing. The science fiction where characters are immortal almost inevitably ends with them being very unhappy, right? 1,000 years from now, they're still, they're now trying to figure out how to kill themselves because they don't want to be immortal anymore. So, that's a recurring theme in science fiction, and it's not a surprise that it's a recurring theme in science fiction, right? Because it's a really uncomfortable place to be. Yeah, this fantasy that you go to heaven, and heaven's this wonderful place with puppy dogs and clouds. Okay, you get past that at some point, unless you don't, which is fine. I got past that at some point. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, what does it mean? Those days that I'm incredibly anxious and just want the day to end, you mean I'm going to have a whole bunch of those in front of me? Or those days that are like that awesome thing happened and that feels good? Or I don't get to have any of those because I'm constrained now in terms of how I interact with it and evolve while I see all this other stuff happening.
I have a simpler answer. So on the one hand...
Sorry about that. That was a good ramble.
No, it was a good ramble. So on the one hand, I mean, I see the promise of AI is just a further... We've done phenomenally with information technology. And we've done really poorly with everything else. Yeah. We've done really poorly with medicine. We've done really poorly. I mean, some people would argue, but we're not living forever. So we clearly haven't made the kind of inroads that we have in information technology. I think AI has the potential to bring us there. And that's why I think the potential is so great. So, you will maybe have the choice of whether you want to live forever or not. And I think AI is the path to bring us there. At the same point in time, I think there's a danger associated with it. And I'm not trying to argue that we shouldn't do it, only because I know that that's a completely implausible case to make. It's going to happen no matter what. So the best thing we can do from a morality perspective is invest in making sure it's the best possible transition. So that's where my interests lie.
Did you ask morality or mortality? Wow! Son of a bitch. That was... Well, there you go. You know what's on my mind right now. I have a question before we go on. Can everybody close their eyes? Raise your hand if you could if you want to be able to upload your consciousness and live forever. Okay, put your hands down. Raise your hands if not that. Okay, put your hands down. 50-50? Pretty close. 60-40, 50-50. Interesting. Thanks.
Please help me thank Brad and Will for a fantastic discussion. It was a lot of fun. So we do not have a break. I'd like our next panelists to come on down. I'll do a quick introduction. We'll get them mic'd up. Take 1 or 2 minutes. Meet somebody else near you. We'll reconvene here momentarily.
Every time I see you, I remind you why I read with your wife Amy in the lab.
Oh, yeah. Good to see you. Mike. How are you? Nice to meet you. Hey, Greg. How are you?
He's totally straight me out. Do you know these books?
No, I don't. I'll grab them. Awesome.
He's a psychotherapist. He noticed when people went into what turned out to be a certain grade or I don't even know, they were giving him data about like Entpre life that was compelling and like that many people can't be wrong. And I was stunned by it. I hope
Thank you. No, I'll definitely read it.
Sounds like a plan.
I noticed that while
You got a turn. Love it.
So
Love
anyway,
it.
thank you.
Hey. How are you? All of our member at Feld. That's hilarious.
They give you an option to play around the names.
I think I have to turn it off.
I'm
in the break.
Where does second round, like the Golden Circle and stuff like that?